This is blood money, because they don't care how many people get asthma. They don't care how many people get lead poisoning.
Neighbors reacting today in court to a settlement that will have Northern Metal Recycling paying the city of Minneapolis $600,000 to combat lead poisoning and asthma in neighborhoods near the facility. And it's all part of a $2.5 million court settlement between Northern Metals and the state of Minnesota over concerns about air pollution.
Just one problem here, though. We still don't know where exactly the pollution is coming from. Tom Lydon of the Fox 9 investigators looking into that question. So, Tom, how did this deal come about?
You know, this was a court settlement. It's known as a consent decree. It was finalized a couple months ago, but it really took years to work out, a couple of years. And a lot of those negotiations happened behind closed doors. For at least 25 years, there have been concerns about Northern Metals of North Minneapolis and air pollution, specifically small airborne particles of heavy metals, including lead. And despite years of air quality testing, there are no studies to determine the exact source of the pollution or any correlation to lead levels in children. A deal may have been reached, but the mystery is far from over.
Tucked along the banks of the Mississippi, Northern Metal Recycling has a slice of prime real estate in a neighborhood long neglected. The company turns trash into money, sorting and shredding scrap metal.
They've all been tested for lead. He's the only one that tested positive for lead.
But as the winds blow across I-94 and into the Hawthorne neighborhood of North Minneapolis, parents worry something is in the air.
Because we had our house tested and it didn't come positive for lead, so we don't know where it's coming from.
It was a year ago that a controversial deal was struck between Northern Metal Recycling and the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. Northern Metals agreeing to shut down their shredding operation and move, but not right away, by August of 2019.
We had difficulties with Northern Metals from the get-go.
Sarah Kilgriff enforces air compliance for the MPCA.
Why is Northern Metals Recycling being allowed to operate for another 2.5 years?
If we had continued to battle Northern Metals in the court system, it could have gone on for a much more lengthy time frame.
Northern Metals sued the MPCA 2 years ago when the agency installed 2 air quality monitors on either side of the scrapyard. Those monitors show elevated lead concentrations, the second highest recorded in the state, at 80% of the federal air standard. The results were averaged out over a 3-month period with spikes that came close but never quite exceeded the federal standard.
Those air quality monitors are literally right next to Northern Metals. And there is a grittiness and a smell to the air around here that's downright palpable. The problem is you can't pinpoint the air pollution with those monitors. It could be coming from a dozen other businesses in this area, including a couple of scrappers. What's more, just a block to the west of us, you have I-94, and there's been decades of lead pollution that's come from leaded gasoline.
And despite all that testing, it doesn't sound like we have a real firm idea of how much pollution they're contributing in that neighborhood.
Well, we certainly echo that frustration. We're working very hard in this area to determine the sources of the pollution and to reduce those emissions.
But one thing was already clear: Hawthorne has a lead problem.
So that neighborhood is one of the neighborhoods in the state with the highest rates of elevated blood lead levels.
According to the Minnesota Health Department, out of 64,000 blood samples taken from children throughout the state, kids in the Hawthorne neighborhood have the second highest concentration of lead in their blood.
That means that about 10% of children less than 6 years old who are tested for lead had a blood lead level above 5 micrograms per deciliter.
5 micrograms a deciliter is the current federal standard for toxic lead exposure, and it means 1 in 10 children in Hawthorne is being affected.
And that's exactly in the vicinity of Northern Metals, interestingly.
To a developing child, most doctors agree no amount of lead is safe.
It turns out physiologically, kids absorb lead way differently than adults. In fact, the amount of lead that will harm a child is much, much, much less than would harm an adult.
Dr. Zeke McKinney is an expert in environmental medicine, but the issue is also personal. He grew up on the north side.
And in particular, growing up in North Minneapolis and seeing an area that was medically underserved very much was an impetus for me to be a physician.
According to census data, Hawthorne is one of the poorest neighborhoods in the state. And poverty, too, is correlated with higher lead levels. Mainly, it's believed, due to lead paint in older homes.
Why does there seem to be a link between lead and socioeconomic status?
It's a great question, and it's for a couple of reasons. People who have lower income have less control over where they're living and tend to live in more urban environments and tend to live in older buildings or closer to an interstate, and therefore have higher levels of exposure.
But there may be an even more complex dynamic between lead and poverty. According to a long-term study published recently in the Journal of the American Medical Association, 11-year-olds who tested for lead at 5 micrograms a deciliter were found to have lower IQ scores 25 years later, well into their late 30s. The study concludes lead exposure could be a factor in lower income, fewer job opportunities, that lead itself may perpetuate poverty, creating a vicious cycle.
If I could move to a different area code, I'd be there.
Dr. Zeke McKinney believes the deal struck with Northern Metals, a known polluter, would never fly in a wealthier zip code.
In areas where individuals are more educated on subjects like this, where they have more wealth, more power, more influence with, the government, with their local officials, they wouldn't tolerate this at all.
And for Hawthorne, a neighborhood with more lead exposure than almost any other, it means 2 more years of wondering what exactly is in the air their children breathe.
And that's why I'm here. That's why I'm a doctor. If I could do anything by virtue of talking to you, I would say, hey, everybody, get out there, get your kids tested.
And the recommendation from pediatricians is just that children under 2 living in Minneapolis and St. Paul should be tested for lead. If you'd like to know the lead level for children in your neighborhood or county, anywhere in Minnesota, there's some new data from the Minnesota Health Department. It's pretty cool, part of an interactive map. We have a link set up at the Fox 9 app. Northern Metals declined to talk with us on camera, but pointed out correctly there are other potential sources of pollution in that area. They also believe they're being singled out by the MPCA. They say there are 6 other metal shredders in Minnesota, and none of them, they say, are submitted to this kind of scrutiny.
Well, okay, so they have to leave by what, 2019?
2019.
Where are they going to go?
Their plan is to go to Becker. Becker is in Sherburne County. It is an industrial area of Becker, and it's just the shredding operation, we should point out, that's moving. And they are still responsible for any contamination that's found on that property in North Minneapolis. Just because they're moving the shredder, right. If they discover lead concentrations there later, they're going to be responsible for it.
Right. And hey, think about getting your kids tested.
That's absolutely.
Bottom line.
Absolutely, especially in Minneapolis and St. Paul where they have the higher lead levels. And I would suggest parents checking out that interactive map. It's pretty interesting and enlightening.
And easy to go to.
Very easy.
All right, thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Tom.